In Proverbs 20, verses 16 to 30, the main counsel is that sin starts sweet but ends sour. And I'm getting this overall counsel from a couple of verses today. First of all, in verse 17, he says, bread obtained by falsehood is sweet to a man, but afterward his mouth will be filled with gravel. There's something sweet and enticing about the forbidden. And so at first, that bread is extra delicious because we didn't have to work for it. But in the end, that sin is going to catch up to us. And that soft, sweet piece of bread is going to turn into hard, crunchy pieces of gravel that not only taste gross, they bust our teeth out of our mouths. And then in verse 21, he says, an inheritance gained hurriedly at the beginning will not be blessed in the end. Sin and folly are always great at the beginning, but we don't find out until later how terrible those decisions really were. So if a child steals the inheritance from their parents, or maybe demands their inheritance early, like in the parable of the prodigal son in Luke 15, that's not gonna go well, because if you don't know how to manage that money will manage you. And not only will you squander it on irresponsible living, but it can even corrupt your heart. So we see this same principle of sin starting sweet but ending sour in most of the verses today. For instance, in verse 16, if you become a guarantor for someone else's loan, that may seem like a good idea at first, but actually you make yourself a credit risk, so that if you try to borrow money, people will have to take your garment as collateral. Because if you're foolish enough to be the security for someone else's loan, it not only shows that you lack judgment, but also if that other person fails to pay their loan, you're going to have to pay their loan, which means you're not going to be able to pay the loan to your own creditor. So they're going to expect way more in collateral from you to guarantee they'll get their payment. In verse 18, kings often go to war because it just feels good to be dominant and to exercise power and expand the empire. But often it's just folly that they end up regretting later, because they get a bunch of their people killed for no reason, or they overextend their empire and they can't keep it under control, or the people under their control hate them for it and end up rebelling. And even though we're not kings, this can apply to our personal relationships. When we're in conflict with someone, and sometimes we rush into battle against people and we put up our dukes and we fight because it feels good to protect our pride and to stand up for ourselves. But then later we realize it caused more problems than it prevented. And if we were to just listen to wise counsel, we would have never gone to war in the first place. In verse 19, sometimes it's sweet to associate with a gossip, because then you get all the juicy details about everyone. But then later you realize that person who's willing to share juicy details about others to you is also willing to share juicy details about you to others. So this sweet relationship actually becomes sour when he ruins your reputation. It can feel good and sweet and empowering in verse 20 to stand up to our parents and to curse them for their rules and to say, I don't need you, I'm going my own way. But then later we realize we have no light and we're walking around in the darkness because we have no guidance. And some commentators even believe this idea of the lamp going out in time of darkness is a reference to death. In verse 22, it feels sweet to get vengeance, and we love to take justice into our own hands. There's a million revenge movies because it feels good to see the bad guys get what they deserve immediately. But then you also see that it doesn't help the person who takes vengeance on them. In verse 23, it's sweet to cheat people in business, but later that's going to come back to haunt you when it gets out and people never do business with you again. Verse 24 is a little harder to relate to the main theme today, but I think the idea is God is using us for His purposes in ways that we do not understand. Whether we do good or evil, He will use us to carry out His plans. And while it's sweet to do evil, it's going to be sour when God uses your evil to bring Him glory by judging you in the end. In verse 25, it's sweet to make promises to God. It makes us feel so righteous and holy, telling God, I'll give you 100 sheep if you get me out of this jam. But then it's sour when later you realize, wow, I promised way too much, and I don't think I can actually deliver on this. And it's only after you made the vow that now you're asking the questions you should have asked before you made it. Like, can I actually afford this? Is this realistic? Am I acting impulsively? And have I really considered the consequences of this vow? And because we didn't make those inquiries at the start, we're going to regret it in the end. It may seem sweet to be wicked at first, but when the king finds out in verse 26, he's going to blow you away like chaff. And in verse 27, a lot of times our wickedness becomes sour later because we're convicted in our conscience. God gave us a spirit to search our inner motives and to reflect on our choices. It's the way God shines his light into the darkness of our souls to expose what's really going on. And a lot of times our evil choices are sweet in the moment, but after self-examination, we feel tremendous guilt and shame as the light of God exposes the darkness within us. And a true king understands this principle that sin starts sweet but ends sour, and he avoids sin and instead leads his kingdom in loyalty, truth, and righteousness. And finally, in verses 29 and 30, both the young and the old have their strengths. The youth should never look down on the old and say they're useless, because those who are older have more wisdom from experience. And those who are older should not look down on the youth and call them a bunch of punk kids, because they have strength and vigor and energy that can accomplish great things in the world. But one of the liabilities of youth is that young people often give in to what's sweet in the moment, and they don't consider how it ends. And so they rush into things, sometimes without thinking, and they bring down strikes and strokes upon themselves as discipline for their folly. One of the greatest benefits of being old is that you understand how things end. And so the challenge for us is to look past the sweetness of the beginning and see the sourness of the end. In Stephen Covey's book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, one of his habits is to begin with the end in mind. And by that he means have a goal. Don't just launch into things without a plan for where you're headed in the future. And I think that's a great habit for overcoming sin, because whenever Satan presents something sweet to us, we need to have in mind how this is going to end. And if you realize how sour this really is going to be for me down the road, we'll have more power to resist it in the moment. I do this all the time at Publix Bakery because I'm looking at all this cake and I love it and it's going to be so sweet, but I know later it's going to be sour because I'm going to be lethargic. I'm going to have a headache from the sugar. I'm going to be spiking my insulin and endangering my pancreas. And after I go through all of that in my head, it's much easier to walk away. And it's the same way with sin. You could have an affair with a coworker and it would be so sweet to have a night together in a hotel. But if you think about that decision a day, a week, a month down the road, you realize how sour it's going to be for you when you lose your wife and your kids and you have a divorce and now you got to split custody and the coworker you thought you were so in love with and was so in love with you ends up leaving you. And now you're left with nothing, not even your own dignity, because you can't stand looking at yourself in the mirror anymore because of the person you've become. We can run through that process every time we're tempted to sin. Just take a journey in your mind past the pleasure of the moment. And usually all it takes is to imagine going down that road for just a little while before we realize how sour it's going to be for us in the end. And this points to Christ, because Satan, when he tempted him in the wilderness, offered him things that would have been so sweet in the moment. Jesus was so hungry, and Satan tempted him to make stones out of bread so he could eat. But that would be bread obtained by falsehood, because he'd be breaking his commitment to the Lord. And Jesus could look down the road and see, if I compromise with Satan and I sin, then I am no longer going to be the perfect sacrifice for the sins of humanity. So if I sin, not only will I face sourness in my own life, but all of humanity will suffer the sourness of eternal condemnation. condemnation. One of the things that makes God unique in Scripture is that He can tell the future. No human beings or false gods can do that. And I think this is one of the reasons why Jesus could stay sinless, because He had the ability to see past the moment and to look into the future and to consider the scenario of Him sinning and what that would look like, not only in His life, but for the rest of the world. And so as we call on God for wisdom today, our prayer is, Father, help us see the future. Help us look down the road, past the sweetness of the start to the bitter end of sin, so that our true end will be with You in the sweetest place of all.